This video presentation is for our final project for POLI 341, Foreign Policy in the Middle East. We decided to pursue a topic relating to our interest in management and economics, so we'll be looking at the Persian Gulf rentier states and their future economic outlook. We'll be covering three main themes. First, how will these rentier states diversify their economies going forward? Second, how will this affect their prospects for democracy? And third, how will this impact their foreign policy towards one another and the rest of the world?
So to begin with, a rentier state is characterized by four major elements. Number one, if rentier situations predominate. Number two, if the economy relies on a substantial external rent, usually from exporting natural resources such as oil and gas, and therefore does not require a strong productive sector. Number three, if only a small proportion of the working population is actually involved in the generation of rent. And number four, the state's government is the principal recipient of the external rent. So we will be focusing on the rentier states making up the Gulf Cooperation Council, namely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, and Oman.
Concerning our first question, how these rentier states will diversify their economies going forward, the global price of oil has tumbled to four-year lows and serves to threaten the state budgets of the members of the GCC. But the GCC states have accumulated vast fiscal reserves over the years that will enable their governments to continue spending even if there is a longer period of weak oil prices. Therefore, the question becomes, where do these cash deep reserves come from, and what was the main source of revenue for the GCC states?
The current growth for GCC states comes from oil, which is the main source of exports and fiscal revenue. For example, in Qatar, oil and gas account for about 85% of export revenues and more than 50% of GDP. There is also dependence of the private sector on low-wage expatriate labor and the concentration of economic activity in the low-skilled, non-tradable sector. This model has led to rapid development, increased standards of living for the state citizens, and extensive welfare programs. But oil revenues and a reliance on a single commodity have proven to be risky. Diversified economies are less likely to experience economic volatility from unfavorable economic conditions and other internal or external threats.
To combat this issue, the GCC states have established billion-dollar sovereign wealth funds. A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund that is established from the rent proceeds of oil and is used as a way to funnel cash into investments. Thus, Middle Eastern rentier states function as commodity sovereign wealth funds. Here, states will see a greater surplus when the price of oil rises, but a fall in prices could hurt the economy. A sovereign wealth fund acts as a stabilizer to the state's economy through investment diversification of the country's money and generates wealth for the future.
Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds reveal numerous different investment strategies due to their history and demographics. Saudi Arabia's large population of over 20 million makes the state more prone to commodity risk. For example, in the 1980s, and again more recently when oil prices plunged, Saudi had to borrow and sell foreign assets to finance state spending. Therefore, we see the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority is heavily invested in cash and fixed income securities, more liquid assets, and the local industries. For example, the state had identified mining as a key investment area after oil and petrochemicals and is investing $38 billion to develop two Saudi cities, focusing on the mining industry and domestic manufacturing. Specifically, in Ras Al Khair, the state-controlled mining company Ma'aden and U.S. aluminum company Alcoa have struck a $10.8 billion aluminum joint venture. And the kingdom has already begun construction on an 870-mile railroad network to Ras Al Khair, estimated at $31 billion.
On the other hand, the smaller Gulf states such as Qatar and the UAE, with citizenship populations of 250,000 and 1.4 million respectively, have taken on higher risk portfolios abroad in hopes of higher potential returns. The UAE has taken on a major airport expansion, new large ports, and several foreign mega real estate projects. In 1994, Qatar created the Qatar Foundation to expand opportunities in education and scientific research. This led to the founding of Education City and the Qatar Investment Authority, the QIA. The purpose of the QIA was to diversify the assets in which the state invested. Some recent investments include Qatar Airways, Al Jazeera, Qatar Financial Service Industries, and some foreign investments such as the ownership of the Paris Saint-Germain football team and a 95% stake in London's tallest building, the Shard.
The use of these sovereign wealth funds was meant to foster sustainable prosperity and preserve the state's wealth, but in reality they have only served to provide another external source of income for the state itself, while not having any effect on domestic job growth. The state should be a growth facilitator by encouraging private sector economic competition and entrepreneurship, rather than acting as an employer of last resort. More diversification, especially in the private sector, is now needed to support the next phase of growth, as a key challenge for the region is to generate jobs in the private sector for the rapidly growing young population.
Looking specifically at Qatar, despite the stimulus that natural gas and oil investments and production has given to the rest of the economy, a more diverse economy has yet to emerge. Qatar is only marginally diversified, with hydrocarbons only decreasing 8.4% from 2004 to 2011. Additionally, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds have remained less transparent as the political structure and personal finances of the ruling elite heavily control these sovereign wealth funds. Therefore, the intertwined government and local economy with these sovereign wealth funds make it increasingly difficult for states to consider diversifying heavily in the private sector or any other investments that do not directly benefit the government or the elites.
Our second main question has to do with how the economic diversification of these Middle Eastern rentier states will affect their prospects for democracy. To understand this, we first have to look at the generally accepted resource curse argument, which is pretty much the notion that an abundance of natural resources, especially oil and natural gas, actually hurts prospects for democracy for two main reasons. First, it enables dictators to almost buy citizens off through extensive welfare spending and little or no taxes. And secondly, it allows the government to equip its security forces with modern, high-quality weapons in order to suppress citizens and dissident groups.
On top of this, the presence of vast oil or gas reserves also serves to prop up dictatorships by giving them the resources to defend against potential rival autocratic groups. So not only does this oil and natural gas hurt prospects for democracy, but it also strengthens the ability of existing authoritarian regimes to maintain power in the long term, and this is important economic benefits. For example, the state can pursue extremely long-term planning and investment strategies because they can be reasonably sure that they'll still be in power decades down the road. And this long-term view allows for much more economic stability and prosperity that in turn reinforces the authoritarian regime, creating a kind of cycle that works to insulate the regime for any challenges to its authority.
So if you throw democracy into the mix, this pretty much changes everything. Disregarding the challenges to establishing democracy in the Persian Gulf in the first place, what's more important is the fact that any new democracy in the region would inevitably be unstable in its early years. The extremely fragmented nature of these countries, combined with the personal greed and corruption, would most likely lead to many short-term presidents or prime ministers, which translates to less concern for long-term investment and planning. Democratically elected leaders will realize that they won't be in power for long, and thus have less of an incentive to plan ahead and make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains in the way that current authoritarian regimes do.
And this in turn can lead to another cycle where you see a reduction in the economic capacity of these newly democratic rentier states, which then leads to less ability of the government to provide generous welfare benefits to its citizens, which in itself leads to disillusionment among the citizens with their new government. This is extremely dangerous in a new democracy because when you get people asking questions like, well, we had better benefits, higher incomes, and more stability under the old regime, what's so great about democracy again?
Another important factor to consider is that any transition to democracy won't likely be a smooth and painless one. The primary concern of old elites in this situation is presumably to hold on to as much economic power as possible and try to take as much as they can before the regime collapses. So you're going to see things like Saudi princes leaving the country with as much money and assets as they can manage to take, which leaves any new democratic regime in a much less favorable economic position right off the bat.
And if we look into the history of most GCC states, we see that most of them were artificially created almost exclusively for the purpose of handling large amounts of natural resources and the money that comes with this. As a result of this, these artificial states are pretty much held together only by their authoritarian regimes. They are fundamentally intertwined with one another, meaning that if these regimes were to be pushed out of power by any democratic movement, you have to stop and wonder, what would they even look like? Would these states as we know it even continue to exist? Or would they fragment along their natural borders? What role would Sunni and Shia populations have in this? All of this leads to the main question of whether or not real democratic change in the region is even feasible in the way they currently exist.
So what we're probably going to end up seeing is a fundamental conflict between the growing economic prosperity that is happening now and the authoritarian regimes that will try to hang on to their power by any means possible. As economic diversification continues, we will inevitably see the growth of the middle class in these countries provide a strong democratic force. There's only so much social spending and welfare programs that the state can provide as a means of keeping the population happy before the rising middle class will want actual democratic change. The third question we're looking at concerns how the foreign policies in general of rentier states in the Gulf have changed in recent years and continue to change today. To begin with, we're going to look at the current shift in the region with the U.S. pivoting slightly away from longtime ally Saudi Arabia and more towards Iran. Despite the ideological differences between them, we believe that significant shared interests regarding stability in the region, as well as the Strait of Hormuz, provide enough incentive for both parties to come to an agreement. Churchill's famous quote is relevant here. We have no lasting friends, no lasting enemies, only lasting interests. Thus, a partnership similar to the U.S.-Soviet alliance during World War II and the U.S.-China relations in the 1970s under Nixon is probable to characterize the changing Middle East relations going forward as well.
Here we have an audio clip of a conversation we had with McGill political science PhD and successful venture capitalist Jim DeWilde.
What is really going on in the world right now is a realignment of power within the region. You know, there's a sense in which if you look at the area, if you talk like Henry Kissinger, if you look at the world you're describing, you're really talking about 3 and possibly 4 historical centers of political power. The Turks, the Iranians, the Saudis, and probably the Baghdad as a capital market in recent times. So what is now happening is the alliances are completely being restruck in the region. The Saudis are desperately concerned, and they should be. I'm not in my political life, I'm not a pro-Saudi guy, but the Americans have finally figured out that backing Saudi Arabia is not a good deal. And that the pivot back to Iran is inevitable if a deal is struck on the nuclear accord. And so then the question becomes, what is the relationship between the 3 big powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then now play that through as a decision maker in all of the so-called rentier states that you're describing.
Now focusing on the relations between the GCC states themselves. The GCC has played the role as the Middle East economic and trading hub and will continue to grow in importance in the next 5 to 10 years. By 2020, the combined economy of the GCC states is projected to be $2 trillion and will provide 1/4 of the world's oil supplies.
On the one hand, we will likely see greater incentives for economic integration similar to that seen in the EU as the next logical step for the GCC states. We may see such developments as a gradual continuation of economic integration, including a single currency, a single central bank, and greater harmonization of legal and regulatory environments. There is still a great deal of uncertainty over the degree to which the GCC states will really work together, given their historical rivalries. But compared to other attempts at a cross-national era of integration in the Middle East, the GCC has made strides in the liberalization of trade and free movement of labor.
On the other hand, however, there are important political factors to take note of in regards to further integration within the GCC. Politics and foreign policy in the region is key, and the process of further economic integration will be directly tied to the political relations within the Council. The tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia will probably be the most important development to follow. While the rest of the GCC states have followed Saudi's lead in maintaining a pretty coherent foreign policy aimed at preserving stability in the region while opposing certain terrorist groups, Qatar has taken a different stance and instead has been a major supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood and other potentially destabilizing organizations that Saudi is opposed to. Because of this and other differences, we've seen the withdrawal of Saudi and other GCC ambassadors from Qatar as tensions continue to rise.
Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have withdrawn their ambassadors from Qatar. The 3 countries accuse Qatar of failing to implement a regional security pact. Under that deal, Gulf countries agreed not to interfere with each other's internal affairs. In its response, Qatar's government has expressed disappointment and surprise. The statement says that the moves taken by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE and Bahrain have nothing to do with their national interests nor their security. The statement goes on to explain that the state of Qatar will always remain committed to brotherly principles concerning their brothers in the Council. Well, this is one of the most serious developments within the Gulf Cooperation Council, otherwise known as the GCC. Now, the bloc is made up of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE and Oman. 47 million people live in these countries, and the GCC is meant to encourage cooperation on the economy, security, defense and the environment. But those ties are now being tested. Well, joining me now is the former Qatari ambassador to the UN and the US, that's Nasser bin Hamad Al Khalifa. So thank you very much for joining us today. Now, what do you think has prompted this action, this withdrawal of the ambassadors?
It is an unfortunate move by the three countries. I think it has no basis, and there's nothing between Qatar which affects their relation with any one of these three countries. Qatar is committed to these three countries as much as they are committed to Qatar in terms of security, in terms of common interest. We are one people. Our interests go together, but it is unfortunate that some of them trying to force Qatar to take certain policies which has nothing to do with the Gulf, nothing to do with Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. It has to do with the outside world, and we challenge them.
This is the main thing, isn't it? I mean, usually the GCC speaks in one voice, they go in one direction, but Qatar is independent. They say that we have a right to stand on our own, form our own opinions. Is this right?
Correct. There are certain issues where we work together because they have common interest to all the GCC. But the GCC itself, as an organization, does not forbid any state to take a different position concerning its relation with other countries. Unfortunately, some of them is trying to impose on us my way or the highway, and right. I think this is a big mistake.
We don't really want to.
So intra-regional investment flows will continue to grow, but traditional political and economic rivalries will prevent full implementation of the common market. States' policymakers will be preoccupied with developing their own individual economies as well, thus leaving regional integration as a lesser concern. Therefore, economic integration will depend on good political relations, and the development of a common foreign policy or a strengthening of shared security forces remains a longer-term project.